We are so happy that you're here. I'm Trina Jones, and with me is Anna Apostoleris, who's one of our law students. Unfortunately, David Levy's plane was delayed in New York last night, and therefore he will be extending greetings later during the day. But for now, on behalf of Duke Law School, welcome and thank you for coming from across the country to participate in this conference. If there's anything that we can do to improve your time with us, please do let us know. Before we begin, we are grateful to our Dean's Office, to the Office of the Provost, to the Program in Public Law, and the Center on Law, Race, and Politics for their financial support, and to Stephanie Loud for her Herculean administrative efforts. We began planning this conference over a year ago at the initiative of our law students. At that time, we were reeling from the deaths of Rakia Boyd, Eric Garner, John Crawford, Mike Brown, and from the use of military force against civilian protesters in Ferguson, Missouri. In addition to the killing of unarmed Black men, women, and children by the police, which is not new, but which modern technology has enabled us to capture, we were also struggling with the acquittal of George Zimmerman following the death of Trayvon Martin. We, like many of you, had serious concerns about the criminal justice system and law enforcement. Yet we were also concerned about other threats to the ideal of democracy, including the effects of the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby County versus Holder, which, as you know, was followed immediately by legislative action to erode voting rights acts across the nation and in this state.
Since our planning efforts began, there have been some high notes. Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, marriage equality, the EEOC's decision in Baldwin versus the FAA, the symbolic yet tardy removal of the Confederate flag in South Carolina, the President's executive action on immigration. Despite these signs of progress, we are reminded almost on a daily basis that the struggle for racial justice continues. The unemployment rate for African Americans and Latinos continues to be significantly higher than that of whites. Income and wealth gaps continue to increase across the board, but these gaps are particularly pernicious for African Americans and Latinos. And the United States incarceration machine, fueled by the prison industrial complex, continues to disproportionately affect African American and Latino communities. Institutionalized racism continues. But it is the faces and the headlines that remind us of racism's human costs and that seem to resonate most deeply. Tamir Rice, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Linwood Lambert Jr., Baltimore, Charleston, McKinney, Texas, Kentucky, North Carolina. And young people across the country are telling us that they do not feel safe on our college campuses and in our high schools. We believe that these protests are not disgraceful. Rather, to do nothing about the underlying conditions which caused them would be.
And that is why we ask you to join us here to have an open and frank conversation about the present and future of civil rights movements. We know that many of you, like many of us, have come here worried and perhaps a bit frustrated. In the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, you may be sick and tired of being sick and tired. But we hope that you will emerge from this conference energized, motivated, and encouraged to continue the hard work that lies ahead of all of us. We are grateful for your presence, and we thank you in advance for the hard work that you're about to do. So welcome. At this point in time, I'll turn it over to one of my co-conveners and my very, very good friend, Professor Angela Onwuachi-Willig from the University of Iowa.
Good morning. So welcome to the open plenary session entitled Reflections on the Present and Future of Civil Rights Movements. This morning's group of plenary speakers will look to the civil rights movements of our past, while also considering the current moments in which we, civil rights scholars, students, and activists find ourselves. They will also ponder the future of civil rights movements and assess the means by which we may achieve our social, legal, economic, and political goals. In his book, Representing the Race, The Creation of the Civil Rights Lawyer, legal historian Ken Mack explores the obstacles that past civil rights leaders, in particular past Black civil rights lawyers, faced in their various challenges to the system of racial oppression. In so doing, Mack explains that early Black civil rights lawyers, who were mainly men, found themselves trapped in a confounding dilemma. On the one hand, in order to perform their job of convincing establishment whites that Black lives were of value and that Blacks deserved the same legal, economic, and political rights as whites, these lawyers had to show they were as different as possible from the masses of Black people. They had to distance themselves from other Blacks to highlight how exceptional they were. In this sense, Mack explains, these Black male civil rights lawyers were also able to advance their arguments for racial equality because they and their extraordinary talents served as perhaps the best proof for why the rights of Blacks should be acknowledged and respected. In essence, their position, their job, and their excellence defied racial stereotypes and showed exactly why it was so unfair to deny Blacks their political, economic, and legal rights. At the same time that these lawyers had to stress their distinctiveness from other Blacks, Mack explains they also had to demonstrate that they were as much like the masses of Black people as possible in order to be perceived as authentic representatives of the Black community. And in 2015, it's important for us to consider not only how much has changed over the past few decades, but also how much has remained the same since that time. Today, we find ourselves in the midst of so many movements: Black Lives Matter, Black Girls Matter, Say Her Name, the Dreamers Movement, Occupy Wall Street, and the flurry of movements that have sprung up in college campuses across the nation, from Yale University in Connecticut to the University of Missouri to Claremont McKenna in California. Today, much like the civil rights lawyers of the past, we find ourselves still caught in the age-old fight of trying to demonstrate to those in power that Black and brown lives matter. We find ourselves at a point where now we have a rich language for understanding what we now call intersectional discrimination and oppression. And we find ourselves at a point where we have a true understanding about how we must really get beyond the Black-white paradigm and begin true coalition building. Sadly, unlike in the past where excellence in communities of color helped to reveal the injustices of the Jim Crow system, as well as blatant racial practices, in today's purported post-racial society, it is these successes in communities of color that we see thrown back in the faces of young minority college protesters, to mark them as whiners, to call them childish, and to trivialize their calls for respect and safety, as though their excellence alone shields them from discrimination, and as though they have no right to expect a world free of racism, ethnocentrism, homophobia, and any other kind of ism. Of course, I could go on, but you and I are incredibly lucky to have a truly distinguished panel of speakers who can lead us in our first conversation and teach us about the past, present, and future of civil rights movements. In fact, it's hard to imagine a better group of people to engage in this conversation. I'm not going to read their full bios. Their bios are printed in the booklets, and I really encourage you to read them so you see how truly amazing they are. But I will note their names, their affiliations, and a fact or two about each of them, about each of these brilliant minds. Thereafter, each of them will offer 2 minutes of introductory comments before we begin our roundtable discussion, and eventually we want to bring you into this discussion. Our first speaker will be Walter Dellinger, the Douglas B. Mass Emeritus Professor of Law at Duke University and a member of the Appellate Practice Group at O'Melveny and Myers. Once named one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal, and the former Assistant Attorney General and head of the Office of Legal Counsel during one of President Bill Clinton's terms, Walter Dellinger successfully argued in the United States Supreme Court in defense of the 2 North Carolina congressional districts that elected the first African-American members of Congress from that state since the Civil War. He also served as counsel of record for the Human Rights Campaign and other national LGBT organizations in filing an amicus brief in Lawrence versus Texas, where the Supreme Court held that laws criminalizing homosexual sex were unconstitutional. The second panelist is Karla F.C. Holloway, the James B. Duke Professor of English and Professor of Law at Duke University. The author of 8 books, most recently Legal Fictions, Constituting Race and Composing Literature, Professor Holloway has served on the Greenwald Foundation's Advisory Board in Bioethics, the Princeton Council on Women and Gender, and she is the founding co-director of Duke's John Hope Franklin Humanities Center and Dean of the Humanities and Social Science faculty. She also is a recipient of numerous prestigious fellowships, including the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Fellowship and a Ford Foundation Fellowship at Harvard's Du Bois Institute. Thereafter, we'll hear from Kevin Johnson, Dean and maybe a pious Professor of Public Interest Law and Professor of Chicano Studies at the University of California Davis School of Law, Martin Luther Jr. King Hall. The author of the book, How Did You Get to Be a Mexican? A White-Brown Man's Search for Identity, which was nominated for the 2000 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He serves as president of the Board of Directors for Legal Services of Northern California and has served on the Board of Directors of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and is a recipient of many honors and awards, including the Clyde Ferguson Award, the Hispanic National Bar Association Professor of the Year, and the National Association of Chicano and Chicano Studies Scholar of the Year. Our fourth panelist is Rachel Moran, Dean Emerita and Michael J. Connell Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA. She also is a former founding faculty member at UC Irvine School of Law and a former president of the Association of American Law Schools. In August of 2015, she became the inaugural William H. Newcomb Fellows Research Chair in Diversity in Law at the American Bar Foundation. In that capacity, she is co-directing a national research initiative on the future of Latinos in the United States with Robert L. Nelson. Our fifth speaker is Madhavi Sunder, the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law. Named Carnegie Scholar in 2006, Associate Dean Sunder has been a visiting professor of law at Yale Law School, the University of Chicago, and Cornell Law School. And her work traverses numerous legal fields, from intellectual property to human rights law. And her book, From Goods to a Good Life, was published by Yale University Press in 2012. And last but not least, we have Ted Shaw, the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Civil Rights at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Prior to this role, Professor Shaw was the 5th Director of Counsel and President of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He also served on the faculty committee that promulgated the admissions program that was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2003 in Grutter versus Bollinger. At this time, I'd like to ask Walter to get us started.
Some unrecallable fashion on the third Saturday in May of 1954, but I will remember forever, shortly after lunchtime on the following Monday, our 7th period teacher in the 7th grade was summoned to the door by our assistant principal, and they had a hushed conversation. And I remember the stricken look on my teacher's face, and she came back to the room and said, and I think I can remember her exact words, she said, "Children, the Supreme Court has spoken. Next year you will go to school with colored children." It was a stunning moment, a moment that in some ways split history and turned the question of race for many white Southerners from a question of fact to a powerful normative question that one had to confront and which dominated my time in the rest of the time in high school and college. What is striking to me is how naive we were in thinking that an end to Jim Crow was going to be the solution. And it was reading James Baldwin while working in a segregated construction site and his writing about his first trip to Charlotte, North Carolina, that made me see that becoming like the North was not going to be the answer. It's very fitting that we have this conference in the year that is the 100th anniversary of John Hope Franklin, with whom I taught for 7 years here. And as he passed away, I wrote that he was one of the most remarkable Americans of the 20th century. He was the master of the great American story of that century, the story of race. John Hope wrote it, he taught it, and he lived it. And I think if he were here, he would tell us, because he was ever the optimist, this is a moment where there is an opening. Minds, I think, are somewhat more open to rethink the systemic role of race in America. And I think that it's fitting that this hopefully will be the start of thinking about the second civil rights movement.
I really appreciate, Walter, that you began with our dear friend John Hope. It's hard to think of him not here. But I also remember him talking about those battles around the civil rights laws, and at the moment when the lawyers were asked to bring in the historians who would save the day, who would give the context of the movement in ways that the law hadn't quite captured. And I do want to say that my memory, like Walter's, begins with a moment of finding the hidden copy of the Jet magazine. My older sister and I found it when Emmett Till was killed. Now, I think my grandparents actually hid the Jet as a matter of course, but and of course we knew where to find it. But when we found that image, I still remember, it's burned into my mind, on the right side of the page of Emmett Till's mutilated body, I knew there was something more to the story than the rights growing up in the North that I had to shift when we came south to visit. What I think is missing from that moment of extraordinary civil rights legislation in the 1960s, and even with the call to the historians that John Hope so eloquently gave us, were the opportunities for cultural studies scholars. We didn't exist back then, so, not an issue, but for cultural studies scholars to give the context of what it would mean to go to school with black or white children in the next year, how our families would shift, how the conversations around our table would change, how we didn't think about how changing the hearts and minds of the populations who would be so extraordinarily affected by the civil rights legislation would be in terms of what happens these 50 years later when we are still facing, even today, some of the leftover, the detritus of that movement, the ways in which we haven't quite understood what it means to have an other in our midst. In universities like this one, in the existence of HBCUs, of which I am an alum, in our prison populations, in our children, in people of color, in the ways in which we find ourselves represented in American society. We haven't yet gotten to the point of that integration that was the promise of the 1960s.
I guess it's my turn, and before I start, I want to make sure and thank the organizers of this conference, Trina Jones, Angela Onwuachi-Willig, and Guy Charles, for bringing us all together. And I want to thank the Duke students as well as the various organizations that are sponsoring this event. I feel privileged to be here, and I want to apologize for the over-generous introduction that Angela Onwuachi-Willig gave. What I want to talk about, just very briefly, is we're at time in our history where it's a good time to talk about the future of civil rights and the civil rights movement. And I think we have to think carefully about the use of litigation and the use of politics as tools in that movement. In light of the current courts that have been created over more than a generation, I think that it's hard to imagine large-scale change coming from the courts. Lawyers like to go to court. I'm a lawyer. I like courts. I like to read appellate decisions. But if you're really interested in lasting change today, it seems to me you should think more carefully about political strategies and how to bring about social change through politics. This is an opportune time to think about that. We have a very vibrant Black Lives Matter movement. We have an incredibly vibrant as well Dreamers movement that came out of nowhere in many respects. We have the Occupy movement. We have people, students on campuses now questioning all kinds of things, from tuition to how they're treated to the racial climate on campuses. I don't mean to suggest that courts are irrelevant. In fact, there's some incredibly important cases pending before the Supreme Court, but I just think that we should think carefully about the political process. And if we do so, we have to ask some very difficult questions, like what is civil rights in the 21st century, in a time of globalization, in a time where the population is increasingly diverse, in a time where criminal law and immigration law have similarities but differences. I do think it's a time to think, what do we mean when we talk about civil rights? I think it's also a time to think about coalitions and possible coalitions between groups. Political change comes about through political work, hard work, difficult work. And I have to say it's easier said than done in many respects. And sometimes just getting groups to work together on issues like racial profiling, getting Latinos, African Americans, Muslims to talk about it, and not being willing to sacrifice the rights of others. One of the things that still sticks in my mind is after September 11th, where there was a poll of African Americans and Latinos finding that they favored racial profiling of Muslims in the war on terror. When if you rely on that kind of statistical stereotyping, it's devastating to minority communities. I've been told I have 0 minutes left. But besides coalitions, I also think, and I'll talk about this perhaps later, is compromises have to be considered carefully, and some of the compromises may be worse than the ultimate legislation you get, and I think that's a cautionary note that I hope to talk about in a bit.
Well, I actually wanted to pick up on what Kevin said and also thank our organizers. This is just a tremendous event and a wonderful moment for reflection and planning for the future. But I want to pick up on the theme of globalization, because I do think very often civil rights is identified with a set of historical circumstances and their vestiges, but the impact of globalization has been profound, and I think we need to connect that explicitly to some of these historical tasks that are still undone. And I just wanted to give you 3 very quick examples in the time that I have. One is immigration. And I mentioned this on our conference call and said, but immigration is a civil rights issue. And it may be to you, but I'm not sure that in the popular imagination or the media, it is understood as a civil rights issue. And because Congress has plenary power over the borders, very often those political questions are not linked up to the domestic preoccupations of the courts. And so when you get to a case like Parents Involved and voluntary integration plans, the court questions the notion of what an integrated student body is because of the demographic complexity of who's in school. We didn't link up the demographic change to our understanding of civil rights sufficiently. The second example, globalization has restructured the marketplace. We now see economic inequality unprecedented since the Gilded Age. And yet, really, how have we talked about that within a civil rights rubric? We really haven't had a space for that in the courts. And on other fronts, it seems that politically we haven't made much headway. And yet that has tremendous implications, and I don't think economic inequality and growing stratification will be colorblind. Finally, the problems of terrorism, which we're living with at this moment, have altered our understanding of national security and in turn have affected policing. And so these are all interconnected, and yet I'm not sure we're making those connections sufficiently. I thought it was very interesting today that the 3 movements were the Dreamers, immigration, Occupy Wall Street, inequality, Black Lives Matter, policing. And all of those ultimately are not episodic issues, even if the movements are largely separate. They are interconnected by the intersection of the domestic inequality that is a legacy and the global forces that are our future, those pressures. And so I hope that we will have conversations about that today.
I also want to thank the organizers for really bringing us together on this for this momentous set of conversations at the most opportune time. So thank you very much. I want to talk about a tool that hasn't really been overtly mentioned yet, but I think was alluded to by Dean Holloway's comments, and yet it is a crucial tool that is essential for the success and sustainability of any civil rights movement, and that's love. King and Gandhi led two of the greatest civil rights movements in modern history in the name of love. Both knew that to bring about change, and most importantly, to sustain it, they needed to cultivate sympathy and love for one's fellow citizens. In her new book, Political Emotions, Why Love Matters for Justice, the political philosopher Martha Nussbaum argues that a society based on the premise of the equal rights and dignity of each person must not neglect the important work of cultivating what she calls political emotions. Without education and arts that help people dive into the intimate life and problems of the other through literature like To Kill a Mockingbird and Between the World and Me, we cannot develop mutual understanding and feelings of empathy and affection for others who are different from ourselves. The central question of this conference, how is cultural change introduced and sustained, must ask what are the tools and prerequisites of social revolution. And social revolution, I think, needs to be distinguished from political revolution. The latter refers to changes in government, but social revolution, or what Kwame Anthony Appiah calls moral revolutions, incite changes in social attitudes, real-world behaviors, and people's ways of thinking. Revolutionary thinking of this sort requires literally a change of heart towards others, as Dean Holloway mentioned, towards persons formerly viewed as slaves, as inferior, and as subhuman. To foster this deeper change, Nussbaum writes that, quote, all decent societies need to guard against division and hierarchy by cultivating appropriate forms of sympathy and love. So from the mantra, women's rights are human rights, to hashtag Black Lives Matter, the challenge is to promote an emotional transformation that would bring strangers and worse still enemies within one's, quote, circle of concern, as the philosopher Nussbaum calls it. We need to see the other as one of us, part of our own nation, community, and story. I am a scholar of law and culture, so I study the role of popular culture and the arts in social production and social revolution. As John Dewey reminds us, there's nothing quite like art as a vehicle for offering an intimacy with the lives of people different from ourselves. Arts education must cultivate, as Nussbaum says, the ability to see full and equal humanity in another person. In short, art matters for justice. It's a critical tool in the process of emotional transformation. As Nussbaum says, if the other has been dehumanized in the imagination, only the imagination can accomplish the requisite shift. So Bono and will.i.am are as important to this conference as the great scholars and lawyers assembled here. Music, book clubs, and conversations in the public culture about television, film, and social media can help foster empathy for distant others and also the critical commentary that's central to a democratic government. Unlike legislation or works of political philosophy, they promote readers' emotional involvement in the events and encourage dialogue. So I just wanted to add there, though, that we are failing to use our imagination the way we need to in the realm of popular culture. A recent report, we can just look at Hollywood media, but a report of diversity or the lack thereof in 2015 shouldn't surprise us. Though minorities are 40% of the U.S. population, they're only 1 in 6 among lead characters in broadcast television. So according to Hollywood, Black lives, Latino lives, Asian lives do not matter. So I think I'd like us to think about how we can capture imagination and art within this movement, because that's what brings the humanity to the movement and sustains it. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very happy and honored to be here. Angela, don't send that note down here. Just look at me and give me the evil eye. That'll be sufficient. I'm happy to be here at Duke. I spend my time now these days at UNC, the poorer cousin in the law school. But I'm very happy to be here at Duke to see how the other half lives. And it's pretty well. Walter, Brown versus Board of Education, you talked about, that moment. And there's a lot that one could say about that. I would just say that I was born about 6 months after Brown. So I have no memory of Brown, of course. But it has been one of the defining moments in my life, and I think in the lives of everybody in this room. I don't know about you all. I have these moments in life, and I can't define when they come and why. But when my feelings are a little bit more raw, I'm kind of right at the top of the feelings. My heart is full. Yes. And I sat here and watched that PowerPoint and was very close to tears, which I think, if they came or if they come, I'd be shameless about. It's a powerful PowerPoint that you put up there of all these people. And I was also thinking, yesterday, quite coincidentally, given everything that's happening in the world, yesterday was the anniversary of the death of Emma Lazarus. I don't know if anybody picked up on that, who wrote that poem, Give Me Your Tired and Your Poor, the rest of it. And so, quite coincidentally, this was the anniversary of her death in 1887, and those words, those sentiments are very much up for grabs right now, as is really the question of who we are collectively as a nation. So there's a lot that I'm feeling. I do want to call the name. I know I probably don't need to because I think she's on our minds and in our hearts, of Jackie Berrien, who passed away. I won't be here tomorrow. I had planned to be because of her funeral. Jackie, of course, ACLU, Lawyers Committee, Legal Defense Fund, recently the commissioner of the EEOC, who tragically passed away all too soon, of course, at the age of 53. So her funeral is tomorrow morning in Washington. And I come here after being at UNC last night when there was a meeting of a gathering of the community at UNC, which I don't have time to talk about, at least not right this moment, but that helps to fill what's in my mind. Now, look, North Carolina, I came here a year and a half ago. Some people say, why did you come here? Don't you want to get out of here, given the politics of the state and what's happening? That's the evil eye. It's
evil eye. So, I hate to do it to one of my former professors, but I am giving you the evil eye officially.
I just said let him go.
No, I don't want to do that. I want to be respectful of everybody. But let me say quickly, there's a war going on right now. And talk about 1954, what we see in this state right now, and you certainly feel it if you're at UNC, is efforts to intimidate, and a lot of people who are frightened and scared. This is the kind of McCarthyism that's going on. So racial McCarthyism and other kinds of McCarthyism. This is a time, more than any other time I can remember, and certainly in this place, but around the country, in which we need to be courageous. It's a time to fight, even at in the face of personal risk in some ways. So I close by saying, and at least close the opening by saying, on my mind a lot is that song from the 60s. There's something happening here. What it is isn't exactly clear. You remember that song? Oh, yeah. Some of you do. There's something happening in this country right now. And when we're in the middle of it, we can't quite figure out where it's going. We can't place ourselves in time and understand. But I know that we're going to be all held accountable. We're going to be judged by history. And it's not a time to be found wanting. I'm so conscious of that because of where we are and what's happening. And so this is an important moment for us to gather, and I hope that we have some rich conversation and discussion, but that we also take something away which fuels our fight.
Okay. So as we think about how we want to fight, it makes sense for us to think about our past. There's a famous saying that those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Civil rights activists have certainly achieved a number of successes over the years, but some civil rights leaders, such as the late Professor Derek Bell, have argued that there were crucial mistakes in past civil rights strategies. For example, Bell famously argued that one strategic mistake that civil rights litigators made was focusing on integration as opposed to focusing on ensuring equal resources in public schools. So what would each of you identify as past civil rights leaders' biggest strategic mistake, if any? Why was it the biggest mistake? Or, if you prefer, what legal or political loss from the past has been the most devastating in terms of its impact on the advancement of the rights of marginalized people?
Let me start. Oh, well, I think in a large sense, the greatest mistake we've made is to too narrowly define, both geographically and in terms of its depth, the scope of the problem. As of 1954, at least this would be true of mainstream white opinion, progressive white opinion, and large segments of elite African-American opinion, of thinking that the problem we had was Jim Crow in the South. And that my friend, the late Haywood Burns, who became a great civil rights organizational leader and classmate of mine, on the day that one of the major events occurred advancing the public accommodations law, I said, "This is a great day." And he said, "Walter, this is the dessert. We haven't had the meal. We don't have the meal. This is the dessert." And until people can afford to go to these restaurants, we're not anywhere. So that it's the searing accounts from James Baldwin, from On the Run by Alice Goffman, the accounts we've read, actually going back to the half that's not been told about the role of slavery in financing capitalism, the New York Road, actually commoditizing slave mortgages was a critical part of the economic development. This was a national problem. Lincoln recognized it. Others recognized it. We lost sight of it given the vividness of the drama of the horror of Southern violence. We lost sight of the fact of how great a national problem it was and how deep a problem we have. And I don't want us to make that mistake again of focusing on high-profile matters when 16 million people are living in this country on $8.50 a day or less. And that not too narrowly defining the scope of the problem is the one mistake I would seek to have us avoid.
One of the things I recall from, I was in college at the transition between one version of the civil rights movement, which was Martin Luther King's, and the next version, which was, as we knew him then, Stokely Carmichael, become to known as Kwame Ture. And the shift there was our argument, at least on HBCUs, around white allyship, and our argument that you all need to go back to your own communities and talk to them. But we never said what you needed to talk to them about. So these days, I'm thinking if we had been more thorough, we would have understood the conversations that needed to take place nationally, as Walter said, were conversations about how, and this goes back to my opening comments, about how our lifestyles, our thinking about equity, our judgments about each other's bodies. The sitting next to each other was not going to accomplish integration in the ways that litigation suggested it would. But sitting next to each other and understanding the respect, as Professor Sunder said, comes from being with the other body. I resist a bit the love dimension, but I'm fully there with Aretha Franklin and respect. So the notion of having that respect for the other and sharing widely within our communities what it means to respect bodies different from whatever we would call a normative body, which was already problematic. I think we didn't do or consider enough the education around that.
I agree with what's been said. I do think it's worth highlighting, and this highlights and reinforces what's been said. The racial subordination underlies almost every structure of American society, and the scope of the problem is quite broad. And if I place some blame, and I don't want to put it on civil rights leaders, but on political leaders, including Democratic political leaders, I think sometimes they're willing to sacrifice the rights of the most vulnerable of subordinated communities to get legislation through. I can think about welfare reform in 1996. I can think about the crime bill in 1994. I can think about the Immigration Act of 1965 that eliminated the national origin quota system from the American laws, eliminated Asian exclusion, but at the same time imposed Western Hemisphere ceilings that eventually led to the undocumented immigrant population from Mexico and Latin America that we have today. And that was actually, Lyndon Baines Johnson viewed that as a major piece of civil rights legislation. The Western Hemisphere ceiling was added as a rider to that bill, and it gained the support of people like Strom Thurmond and the American Legion to support the legislation. And you have to ask yourself, are these sacrifices worth the legislation that ultimately gets passed? And to me, that's a cautionary note when it comes to immigration reform in the future of immigration in this country.
Well, I wanted to pick up a little bit also on what Walter said, and that is that I think a really significant part of the problem has been that we have so much unfinished business because of that unduly narrow scope. And I wanted to identify the case that I think has been a significant setback as San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. If you go back and read the case, the court cites the soaring rhetoric about the importance of education in Brown, and then says, we agree that education is important, but that doesn't make it a fundamental interest. And what the court did in that moment was to draw a line in the sand between negative rights and positive rights, and to say positive rights are not going to be part of the American credo, of the American Constitution. Because if something as foundational as education is not a fundamental right, then it's hard to imagine what would be. The court did leave open the possibility that an absolute deprivation of educational opportunity might violate the Constitution, that you couldn't be left illiterate and innumerate. But beyond that, all bets were off. And the legacy of that is today substantial inequality. We do not see in this country the level of upward mobility that other countries that we consider our peers have. We have growing inequality, less mobility. Wealth is not a suspect classification. Education is not a fundamental right. Consequently, we cannot create a set of protected minimal entitlements that are the material precondition for dignity in this country. And for that reason, I would identify that case as the most significant setback, because it is a philosophical line in the sand. It is an ideological boundary that we have not been able to cross.
So when I think about mistakes, I go back to what Professor Johnson said. I think one of the biggest mistakes, ironically, given who we are who gather in this room, and what we agree, I think, about the significance of Brown, is the seductive, at least for me, belief that law can be a leading instrument in social change, and what flowed from that. And indeed, law has played and continues to play significant roles. Think about same-sex marriage, recently. But I've come to believe and understand very deeply that more important, and this is what you were saying, I think, a few minutes ago, more important than law is activism. And I've come to say repeatedly that when lawyers think they're going to lead social movements, in their role as lawyers, underscore that clause, those movements are doomed to failure. It's not that lawyers can't lead movements. I point to Gandhi, who was a lawyer, but he didn't lead the movement against British colonialism and for independence in his role as a lawyer. Mandela was a lawyer, didn't lead the movement against apartheid in his role as a lawyer, et cetera. And so it's important work, but more than anything else, we need activism. And law can turn activists into bystanders often, and we lawyers can be very arrogant about our role. There's a connected issue that came into my mind, and it was something I really wanted to say, but as I get older, things come into my mind and they go out. So I want permission, if it comes back, can I just?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Conversation. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation, but just two quick things. Going back to Walter's opening, I think that our prioritization of civil and political rights at the expense of social and economic rights, that globally, and particularly in this country, in terms of the way we understand rights and what our ultimate goals are, and that really goes back to, I love the way you phrased it, Dean Moran, the material preconditions of dignity are so important. That said, civil rights and civil liberties are paramount and incredibly important. And so in terms of one of our biggest mistakes that we are still paying for again and again and again within our legal doctrine in this country is Korematsu versus U.S., 1944, the Supreme Court legalizing racial profiling in times of war. And we've paid for that through the Japanese internment, again with Guantanamo and Muslim Americans' civil liberties being horrifically jeopardized after 9/11, and now we're seeing it in the immediate acts of Congress and governors around this country closing their doors to Syrians who are fleeing horrific war at home. So I think this is something, and we talked about globalism and terrorism and this idea of the enemies people who look like the enemy being enemies, and it's a history that we're repeating, but we need to stop.
So I appreciate that everyone talked about how narrowly we defined the problem, how narrow the scope was, and it seems like one of the obstacles, right, in addition to sort of some of the cases that have even narrowed that scope even more, is that we have generations of people who've been taught an even smaller narrative, right? They've been taught a very simplistic narrative about, well, there was once thisism, and we had a movement, we had some laws change, and now everything's okay. And so how do we, as civil rights activists, as scholars, as people interested in change, how do we get others who we need to know that to broaden their acknowledgement of the scope of the various problems that we face?
Well, I was struck when I went to the University of Mississippi right out of law school to teach political and civil rights to the first integrated classes at Ole Miss. Part of what motivated me was the thought that this was 1966, that my highest and best use was to try to reach out to white Southerners and try to convince them. I actually thought single-handedly I could white Mississippi lawyers with the power of my eloquence, but I didn't quite have the right way of thinking about what I was thinking until Chris Rock said it. Now, until Chris Rock said, we don't have a race relations problem, white people have a problem. We don't have blacks didn't need to make progress, white people needed to make progress. He said, white people are crazy, and then now they're a little less crazy, so things are a little better. That Obama being elected president, he said it's not black progress. There have always been black people who would have made excellent presidents. We needed white progress. And I think I sort of understood that until we change that calculus and the stunning fact that nearly half of American whites believe that the greatest discrimination problem is discrimination against whites on the basis of race. Nearly half the public and either 4/9 or 5/9 of the Supreme Court, depending upon which case it is, believe that. So I think how we do this educational function is simply appalling. one of my projects is to ask, what would you know about the history of race in America if you were an anthropologist? And what you had to work with were the nearly 600 volumes of the U.S. reports, replete with hundreds of cases involving race. And the view of race in America that you would have would be so stripped of any context. It would lead to part of the narrative that, we had our eyes on the prize and then we achieved the prize, and that was it. But I think the fact that we finally have video cameras are awakening more people to a reality they simply did not know existed. And that's why I think it might be a moment of opportunity to begin the educational process about the depth of the systemic problems of race in the American DNA.
I think we're all on the same page here, and I think, Angela, you mentioned intersectionalism, and I was thinking intersectional discrimination, I think you mentioned earlier, and I was thinking we owe that term intersectionality to a Black feminist theorist, Patricia Hill Collins, who brought the language of intersectionality that we now use so easily in critical race studies. But understanding what that means is sort of like in medicine when we talk about interdisciplinary care teams. That just means all the doctors in the room fussing with each other, not all the doctors in the room sort of sharing their knowledge and seeing where they might position themselves in reference to the patient. So this intersectional respect for the ways in which our knowledges might be filled out by the experiences of others, by different voices in the room, by which communities need to be educated. I think that's the place where we have the opportunity to pay attention. I'm a little less maybe I'm a lot less optimistic than Walter is. I'm really worried about this contemporary moment, and especially the moment that's coming up with us around Syrian refugees. And looking back, I was tweeting this early this morning about Korematsu and how we're back there at that decision. And it has come back to haunt us and never, explicitly overturning it. And you're right, just, legislating racial discrimination. So we're going to find a way to ignore the laws of the country because there is this social concern about war and terrorism, which is an uninformed concern anyway.
I'm all for education of everybody, including white people. But it strikes me that the only way you're going to get people to pay attention is by being in their face and being political and being activists in making them pay attention. I think we've had the problems in the criminal justice system for generations, including, and videos did contribute to increasing attention to the brutality engaged in by police along racial lines. But I think that the fact that those weren't buried under the rug in part came about because people reacted, people took to the streets, people let their voices be known. We've had problems on college campuses for generations in terms of race relations. Students are calling administrators on it now, and people are starting to pay attention. It strikes me that one way of educating administrators and leaders is by showing you take it seriously and by being pressing those grievances, because if you don't press those grievances, if you didn't press Ferguson, people just said, oh, that's an unfortunate situation that happened to happen. And it happens all too often. And I would say that these issues of race are buried throughout the criminal justice system and have been around forever, but now we're just getting some of the attention that they deserve. Same thing in Korematsu has been influencing immigration enforcement, for generations, and allowing the immigration officers to consider Mexican appearance and immigration stops and things like that. And if you know what Mexican appearance is, I'd like to know because I've been working on that one.
Well, I wanted to focus on something that isn't going to solve all the problems, but you mentioned the project that I'm doing at the American Bar Foundation with Bob Nelson on the future of Latinos in the United States. And we have several of our advisory council members at this meeting, including Kevin, and Christina is here. And I don't know if Jennifer is here yet, Jennifer Chacon. But we are really looking at the problem of a population that will account for 1 in 3 Americans by 2050. Which still experiences significant disparities in a number of ways, and the infrastructure is not keeping up with the growth of the population. And so what this project is designed to do is, first of all, to map out the existing resources. What do we know about this population? We've put together the most comprehensive annotated bibliography of which we're aware. We're creating GIS maps of various kinds of resources around the country. We also are putting together regional roundtables, and we decided from the beginning that we ought to have change agents at the table. So not just legal academics, not just academics, but academics across a variety of fields and change agents, and to do something really different, scenario planning, so that instead of just excavating the past or accounting for the present, we would think about the future. And we'll be having those around the country and then a national summit. We also want to enlist law schools and helping to close the access to justice gap for students, and we're actively working on a proposal in that area. We're creating a website that will be a wonderful resource, and throughout this, and I want to emphasize, we really want to involve new leaders, because our sense in the Latino community is that a lot of the activism is coming from youth, and they are going to make or break this moment. And we need to help to train them to be effective advocates by giving them the information and the tools that they need. And so we will have them at the table as well in a variety of capacities. But if you're interested in learning more, I'm happy to talk to you. I'm here for the entire conference. But that is what we're trying to do through the American Bar Foundation to begin to address some of these issues.
So I want to go back and add I didn't say anything about some of the worst cases. And I want to mention, too, without getting into substance, because time doesn't permit. One is McCleskey, because of what McCleskey did with respect to the entire criminal justice system, which is that it condoned, it signed on to a system that is explicitly racially discriminatory and says we can't do anything about that. It's too big for us. So, it's too big for us. We just can't touch it. It is another Dred Scott, in my view, in terms of what it says about the place of race within our legal system. That's one thing. And it's a blot on the Supreme Court, another blot on the Supreme Court. The other case, ironically, in my view, perhaps ironically, is Bakke. And time doesn't permit me to go into this, except to say that at the moment it was decided, Bakke was a loss for African Americans. And one of the reasons it was a loss, and its significance extends beyond African Americans, is this business about societal discrimination. Discrimination for which nobody's responsible, for which there is no remedy. The court wrings its hands about it and washes its hands of it. And another statement of the place of the courts with respect to law and a conscious decision to leave untouched the vast body of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. So those two cases. Shift for a minute. Look, I believe more and more that, right now, you just said that young people, the agency that they're displaying right now in this new movement or these movements that have sprung up. I think our role, at least, folks in my generation, is twofold, actually threefold. There's still work for us to do, obviously. We still have to go on with our place in the struggle, but at the same time, and that's both activism and in academia, but at the same time, part of our role is to get out of the way of these young folks, to be supportive of them. So I was at Carolina, I said last night, there was a demonstration. It was on NPR this morning. It's in the news. Look, frankly, I could give you a critique about what the students did and what I thought was effective and what wasn't, but that's not what matters. What matters is that they are out there engaged in activism and struggle, and they're waking up. And so, our role, my role, is to be supportive of them. If they came to me and asked me some questions in private, I give them some answers. But ultimately, my answers aren't what's important. This is something that, in some ways, is passing out of our hands, and that's as it should be, I think.
I wanted to address what Dean Holloway said about love being maybe too hard. And, respect, maybe we can get there, but love, especially for the enemy, as we're seeing here in this time of terror. And I guess one thing that I think we can get to, though, is a shared love of our nation and our highest American ideals. And I think that we're seeing that being used in Obama's immediate response via Twitter to the House's actions with respect to shutting the doors against the Syrian refugees. He said, that's not who we are as a country. That's not who we are as a people. And I think Professor Shaw mentioned the Lazarus poem. And so I think this idea of love, a shared love of who we are and what our highest values are is going to be important. But in terms of what we can do too, on the ground, it's all, to me, always comes back to the local and acting locally. In Davis, California, where I live, we named our newest elementary school after Fred Korematsu. And so 600 kids every year learn about that history, but really this broader idea of what does it mean to be an American, and it's not based on the color of your skin or your funny name, but it's about that commitment to those highest national values and ideals.
Could I just respond briefly? First of all, I have to correct the record because there are people at Duke now scared that I'm still a dean. It's Dean Emeritus. So I'm looking around for where Dean Holloway is. She's now a member of the faculty and very scary. But the notion of love isn't too hard. I just worry about subordinated bodies always being the ones in public who have to display our bodies as available for the most intimate spaces of our lives. So I'd like to reserve privacy and intimacy, especially for bodies that are often regarded in public as the bodies to be displayed. So that's why I move towards respect and regard. But love for me is a private space, which I would like to, and I'm big on privacy, especially for women and girls of color, the sort of privacies that these images that we saw are so hurtful because in one sense we are always already on display. So my resistance to love is just, I want to keep that private rather than to make it available to every somebody.
So
which is not a real word, I know.
I wanted to follow up with a couple of things that you've said, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So the first is, I think, in part, thinking about McCluskey and thinking about other decisions, I think in part we have McCluskey because of what Kevin said, that there are segments of our society that are the most vulnerable, whose rights get traded off in certain instances. And so one of the questions is, how do we avoid the pressures to trade off the rights for the most disfavored members of our communities for whatever we view as potential gains for more favored members of those groups? And then also, I'll give you a chance. You can either answer either one of that question or the question about that sort of turns back to what you pointed out as sort of the biggest strategic mistake. What are your suggestions for ways that we can get past whatever you highlighted as the biggest strategic mistake? And then we'll open it up to the audience.
Well, let me say something about the trade-off issue. I think about this a lot. I think probably we all do. Right now there's a discourse, as there was after 9/11, about trading off rights for security. But my understanding of that discourse usually is what it means is trading off somebody else's rights for your security. It's not about people, for the most part, it's not about people being willing to trade off their rights, at least not the core rights. I mean, they're willing to get on a line and be x-rayed and having, in effect, pictures taken of them now in the airport of their naked bodies or some semblance of it. But when it comes to really intruding into their rights in the most important and fundamental ways, I think the discourse is about trading off other people's rights and that's important. But look, it'll never work out well. After 9/11, I was interviewed by, I think, the Rockefeller Foundation it was, and they were talking about, they asked me what was my greatest fear after 9/11, and I didn't have to think long about that. It was, that we'd lose our soul as a nation. And that's exactly what we face right now with this discourse about Syrian refugees. I mean, what Governor Christie said is inexcusable. Inexcusable in my view.
What did he say, Ted?
That a 3-year-old Syrian refugee child, he would keep that child out of the United States in the name of national security. That trade-off issue, in my view, is one that, now is the time more than any other time. It's what Karl Marx teaches us, that we have to speak up and elevate rights, even at the expense, perhaps, of our security. There's no question that we can't insulate ourselves from the possibility of terrorism in this age. I mean, we just can't. All we can do is the best that we can do. But I know that if we trade away our core values as a nation, we've lost. Terrorists have won. I'll stop there.
Other people?
I think that we should at least recognize when we do make trade-offs that some rights are being sacrificed. I think at times that there isn't the conscious acknowledgement that some rights are being sacrificed. The Immigration Act of 1965, which I mentioned before, it was portrayed as a civil rights achievement. The signing was on the steps of the Statue of Liberty, and everybody sort of downplayed the fact that certain rights of people in the Western Hemisphere were being sacrificed. I think that when there's a discussion of like immigration reform in the future, some would say, well, maybe a path to legalization but not citizenship is sufficient. And then my question is, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that we have a renewed caste status in American social life? And I think that we have to think hard about what trade-offs, not just of other people's rights, but also in terms of getting some piece of positive legislation through, are we willing to make? And I think, unfortunately, sometimes we don't even have that discussion and dialogue, but we just sacrifice. And actually, the Syrian and Iraqi discussion now is atypical in the sense that we're actually discussing it, because oftentimes it's buried under the rug and nobody's paying any attention at all.
Well, I'm sorry, but we're going to have some discourse like that, but, I meant to, look, what we have on the table now is a presidential candidate, whatever we may think, however fringe we may think he's talking about, going into mosques and also requiring Muslims to have some kind of identification and to register. That's the discourse that we're having now. That I just wanted to add that.
Oh, I was just going to say, and the fact that there are not enough people afraid of that idea of registration, and that we have a history of it that does not thoroughly discredit even the idea of engaging registration or stamping or following any person in America suggests that, how many Democrats, this was a bipartisan vote in the House yesterday. So the idea that bipartisanship can erode our either fundamental rights or the rights of that are declared in positive law is a fearsome space that we are in terms of our social structure today. So when war allows us to erode our law, it's because we do not have the respect for the rule of law as an orderly space and an articulation of our values as a society.
Well, I would add that I do think one of the great problems we've had, and I do want to link this back to the international pressures of a kind of global capital market, is that we've increasingly in this country confused liberal individualism with privatization. Mm-hmm. And privatization means that we do not have the same sense of shared fate. And so there's this kind of naive belief that it's going to happen to that person, but if I just mind my P's and Q's, it won't happen to me. I think there's also been some mythology that we're not all affected by some of the forces of stratification. So, for instance, there's a sense that there's a cohort of poor people, but the middle class are secure. They feel very insecure. And moreover, the Federal Reserve in Chicago did a study that showed that a household after the Great Recession headed by a black college graduate had less wealth than a household headed by a white high school graduate. So we have ongoing disparities that are severe, but when we face a moment of crisis because we haven't got our democratic muscles in good shape, what we can only achieve is a solidarity of fear because we have nothing else in common anymore. And I think this is a great tragedy of our democracy. And thinking through how we interrupt rhetorics of privatization, I think, is very important. For example, around things like higher education, which has been the gatekeeper to upward mobility in this country and is increasingly out of reach for many. Many are being shunted to community colleges where they don't finish, where we're spending less in California on a community college student than on a K through 12 student, and we're at the bottom in K through 12. So we are creating an illusion of opportunity rather than a reality, and then we engage in a rhetoric of blame as though it was that individual's own fault that they didn't succeed.
You know, one of the reasons that economic inequality is more serious today, I think, than at other points in our history is that we no longer have that public floor. So when I grew up, my mother was a widow at the age of 40 with 3 kids and a high school education, wound up selling socks, ties, and underwear to support the children. So we were very poor, but big caveat, being white, what was open to me was a very good high school system, a very good public school system. We had just moved to the edge of the better school system. The public parks, I had a public librarian in downtown Charlotte. The bus system worked. In the 7th grade, the public librarian helped me research things I was interested in. All of this, I had a 10th grade teacher that bought me a 2-year subscription to the London Economist. Wow. So the public, we swam in the public pools. We went to the public parks. Now, again, the big thing was I recognized that these opportunities were if you were white. Now, we dropped the color line, but I don't know that it is coincidental that once we opened all of these public resources to African Americans, we then stripped them of any of the qualities. We do it with our state universities. We do it with our public schools. Our parks have deteriorated. The swimming pools are closed. So we had the wonderful end of Jim Crow, and then, at least in the South, we don't have we now equal entitlements to denuded public resources.
I think we have to see the intentionality in that stripping, that it's not a, instead of like the incidents on college campuses, if we see them as a whole, then we can ascribe an agency to them that we are usually reluctant to do. And the agency is white privilege.
I think,
just to be clear.
I think, too, that when we think about economic rights in this next wave of civil rights struggles, we have to recognize that where in the 20th century we were focused on real property rights, tangible goods, and brick-and-mortar businesses, in the 21st century we live in a knowledge economy, and we need to, through our education, our public education system, we need to prepare diverse young people to be able to understand technology, to be ready for STEM, because this is where the material gains of the present and future will be. We need to hold Silicon Valley, which is around the corner from where I live, accountable for, and otherwise we're going to see massive increases even further with respect to economic inequality.
I think our failure to see race where it is almost like under the glacier in what happened to our criminal justice system that would not have happened except for race, which is mass incarceration. And what is really extraordinary is that we criminalized the supply side while moving to decriminalize the demand side. And the racial consequences of that were extraordinary. I mean, what you have is one major university had a use of hard drugs at one of the fraternities. They had recruited a 14-year-old black kid to supply, to be the supplier. He got one of those 30-year prison sentences. They got 1 semester social probation. And that it's when every criminologist knows that if you want to use the criminal law to reduce the incidence of some bad behavior, you go after users because they're deterrable, whether it's prostitution or whatever. But we insist on harsher and harsher penalties for those who are supplying it. And now everybody's all happy because we're decriminalizing marijuana for use, but we're still keeping the criminal penalties for people that supply it. And we would never have used the criminal law if we were sentencing fraternities full of white middle-class boys to lengthy prison sentences. We'd be horrified at the use of the criminal law. And the fact that the racial consequences of that have just been extraordinary. And people don't even notice when we talk about reducing the penalties for use that you're just enhancing the disparity and the inequality of the use of the criminal law to deal with the serious problems of addiction.
And we haven't even discussed even well.
Yes.
I say that, I've been in rooms, it may be some of that reaction in this room. I may be misreading people. I saw a couple of heads shake, but even well versus Abbott. I suspect even in this room, I suspect there's some people who aren't aware of it. Am I right?
Right.
And I've gone into educated. I spoke to a room full of Harvard graduates the other night in the Triangle area. And I asked how many of them knew what I was talking about. Not a hand went up. This is a case that's up before the Supreme Court. The issue is whether when we do apportionment, every 10 years, who gets counted? Right now, everybody gets counted. The case is pushing to make sure that only registered voters are counted. Not children, not people who have been stripped of their right to vote by reason of incarceration, not people who aren't citizens but who are part of our communities, even though the impact with respect to where and how federal funding flows is on everybody. This case is huge. This case and the racial implications are huge. It is nothing less, in my view, than an attempt to have power remain in the hands of a group of people and keep others subordinated and lock in that subordination. So this case is huge. It's as big as Citizens United. And there needs to be organizing and consciousness around this case.
Can I add to that? Because
Yes, we'll
as
hear
part of our Latinos in the future of Latinos in the United States, this case was granted cert, and we went out to look around and see what was happening. And what we discovered is if there is evidence of a lack of access to justice in the Latino community, the complete lack of advocacy. I mean, there's just a few organizations, the usual suspects that are involved in this case. And when you looked at the media coverage, it was presented, it came out of Texas as a rural-urban case, not as a Latino case, not as an African-American case. And the lack of media understanding of the significance of this case was astonishing. And this made us feel that we really must enlist law schools to become more involved in serving the needs of the Latino community, because if you look at the Supreme Court clinics out there, they're not really advocating on behalf of Black and Latino communities. They're talking about the technical difficulties of counting under the new rule that was proposed. This is not a merely technocratic question. This is a question of political representation and political identity. And so if this case didn't get onto the radar screen with its significance, and I completely agree with you, and I'm really glad you brought it up, what else are we missing? So I think it's profoundly important.
I was counsel of record in the case for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and did their brief. And there's a good chance that this will be misperceived as a win. There's a real risk in this case. So the case is that Texas, like every other state, for as long as we've had apportionment, with the tiniest exceptions of a community that had a large military installation, there are just a few exceptions. We have always used total population. And that is a system by which representatives have been allocated among the states since 1790, is on the basis of total population, with the 3/5 clause being the only exception to that. But women were counted. Everybody's been counted. So this would be a major change. Now, the litigators are seeking to compel Texas. The Texas Attorney General is on the, quote, right side of the correct side of this case, defending total population. The litigators are saying a state is constitutionally required to count only registered voters because otherwise it violates the constitutional rights of the people who should be counted, whose vote is, whose privilege, we might say, is diluted for. But the risk is that the Supreme Court will reject the litigators' insistence that states are compelled to do this, which would be a victory, but that the court would say in its brief, however, states may choose, they may see it as a states' rights case, states may choose to use a different system. So just as after Shelby County, we had a profusion of legislation, you would see bills introduced in legislatures throughout the country if the court said, we're not going to compel Texas to move away from, but Texas is free to do so if it chooses. So we wrote in our brief, I specialize in telling the court not to decide things. So one of the parts of our brief that, and worked with the Solicitor General, part of the U.S. brief, one of the parts of our brief that is critical says, don't reach that issue. It's not before you. And you don't have a record. You don't know why, in what context, a legislature would have decided for the first time in all of these decades to adopt something other than that. You don't know what kind of package of legislative voting restrictions it would be a part of. You have no evidence of what the motivation would be for doing that. If you say anything, you should say it would be constitutionally suspect to move away from total population. But do not green light this because you don't have a record before you. You don't have a context in which you could say it would be fine for states to move away from this without knowing why they're doing it.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
There are a ton. Back here, your hand went up first.
I'll be very brief. Can we talk about the Tea Party for a moment? And I realize that their influence has waned and popularity has waned, but I've just been amazed at how effective that social movement has been at translating activism into raw political power. And I saw it in my home state of South Dakota where there was an intervention, a national organization intervened in a local school board bond issue to defeat it, additional funding for schools. That kind of thing, I'm just amazed at the power. And I'm wondering why movements like Occupy, and I could be just wrong on this fact, movements like Occupy and movements like Black Lives Matter, why has there not been the same ability to translate it into raw political power?
One answer is that those movements on the left are not backed by the hidden hand of large money and even that's what's behind this. And these people think, oh, this is a people's uprising, not realizing there's an entire television network and communication, major communication system that has sponsored this. It said, as if they were covering news, said there's going to be a rally in our locality of Tea Party patriots, and one of our anchors will be there to cover it. Well, it didn't exist before, it was done. So that what is striking to step back from it is, looking back recently, we've seen various programs on the Roosevelts, looking back at the New Deal, a recent one on Huey Long, for example. In the time of economic distress then, people turned their ire on the corporate malefactors whose greed had played such a role in leading to the Depression. Roosevelt attempting to channel that in ways that he could. This time around, when we've had the stagnated middle class and increasing poverty, people's attention has been directed to Washington as the source of the problem. And that has been very, very skillful, and it's been done with lots and lots of behind-the-scenes money behind it. So that's one of the reasons they're I think, so effective.
Could I just say, because I don't think the Tea Party has disappeared at all. I think the Republican Party is now the Tea Party. So if we see the contemporary group of candidates who are statistically above the others, the more institutional, politically identifiable candidates, we can say the Tea Party is now the current evolution of this, backed by all the things that Walter said. So the language might have gone away, but I suggest we pay careful attention to who's making the noise about the problems are in Washington and what the top candidates are saying and who they are.
The only thing that I would add is that I think in addition to having resources, what you see for a lot of these organizations that don't have resources is they're just struggling to get by. They can't network effectively with other organizations with shared interests and concerns because they're just so focused on getting through their own challenges. And what you saw on the right is an ability to develop a strong network that magnified, that amplified the impact of any given organization. And for lawyers, at least, Ann Southworth, my former colleague at Irvine, has written a book called Lawyers of the Right, which describes the ways that networking was used to significantly improve the outcomes for what was in fact a small group of organizations. And so that might be of interest because I think there might be some parallels.
So can you tell us your name? Just when you ask your question, can you say your name? What's your name?
Yeah, I'm Rob Knowles from Valparaiso.
Thank you. All right, so your hand went up next.
Okay. I'm Harvey Gilmore from Monroe College in New York. And I share Professor Holloway's hesitation about love. For this reason, I think we can all agree that there's no bigger example, in my mind at least, in seeing others as the enemy as in the relationship between the police and communities of color. So my question is, how would somebody in a community of color even begin to entertain thoughts of loving the police when there's been a history of police brutality to the point where communities of color have been profiled and brutalized and marginalized to a point, perhaps, past reconciliation?
I guess I have to answer that one. So, I guess let me begin by saying that I don't mean to say that love is easy at all, but it is absolutely political. Everything we're facing today is because of a politics of hate. It's a politics of fear. It's a politics of anger and disgust. It's an emotional politics. And so to counter that politics, we need to have emotions to the contrary, the emotion of love, the emotion of understanding, the emotion of sympathy. And we need to do that by talking to each other, by sharing stories, by reading, and the images that we began with. I think that was just such a powerful beginning of this conversation because the stories say everything. The photographs say everything. The photograph of the 3-year-old Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, moves us. So I think that we that's who, as human beings, we respond to that emotion and viscerally to music, to image, and story. And so I don't give up on it. We can't. And that's how we operate as people. So I have profound optimism about it.
I would love to have that conversation, and I'll start by asking this. Are there any cops in the room?
Maybe. Melissa, and then let's go back here, and Hari and Daniel. All right. Oh, and I see it. Okay. Sorry. See Anthony and Natasha.
Diane Robertson from North Carolina. I want to speak to a little bit to what all of you have mentioned, but to what Professor Shaw has talked about with regards to activism and coalition building. just yesterday, our very own Reverend Barber, who is the head of the Moral Monday Forward Together movement in North Carolina, was speaking at Princeton, has had a lot of attention nationally for the work he's done in North Carolina. So I would suggest that in your own states, especially those of you who are working on these issues, that is a model of coalition building of over 200 progressive organizations in North Carolina that are making what we would say small changes, but a big splash on the issues that you're talking about. And we are at a time when everyone has to get re-engaged. I think we sat back for a long time thinking we had made so much progress, and all of a sudden we see that the Tea Party is now the Republican Party. And our choices are very limited on the political spectrum. The second thing I would say is yesterday I was at that meeting at UNC, and the students, I was so encouraged to see that they have not, am I dead here? That they have taken some of the lessons that the students of the 60s had left behind and picked up on those and said, we're just going to walk in here and let you know what we think, and we're not going to be polite, and we're not going to accept the fact that this is making you feel better to do this because it doesn't make us feel better to believe that you really have our best interests at heart. That was really one of the messages. My fear is that this young generation does not see voting and political solutions as solutions to the problems that they have. And we don't have a lot of choices in this country outside of the political system. So somewhere we have to get voting rights and the issue of the franchise as part of the mix of how we move forward. Otherwise, our options are so narrow, and the other side, even with smaller numbers, wins.
So I'd like to do 3 questions at a time, and hopefully we can get to everyone. So I have Melissa Murray, Hari Osofsky, and Daniel Morales. Melissa's right here. Can you stand up, Trina?
Thank you. This is a great panel. Rachel, your comments about privatization were so resonant. And I guess I'm wondering about the rhetoric of privatization and how it relates to marriage and marriage equality. Mm-hmm. Marriage is perhaps the most profound vehicle of privatization that we have in our society. It is a way that we seek to fill what is left of a tattered public safety net. And now it's become a vehicle for relationship respectability and dignity. And I wonder if marriage and the marriage equality movement it can be seen as at odds with some of the things that we're talking about. And so I would like maybe the panel to address how different civil rights movements can actually undercut and stymie the progress of others.
All right, so Daniel's right next to you, and then Hari's in the back. Hari, can you raise your hand?
This has been amazing. Thank you. I want to talk, I'd love to hear what you think about sanctuary cities in the context of this conversation we're having about love. And, to me, sanctuary cities are an incredible development. And there's space where that kind of love, or I usually think of it as like a cosmopolitan ethos, right, are being nurtured. And how do we structurally protect that space, especially in the immigration context where we have plenary authority, we have a sort of default position that the national is the answer. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Next panel.
Hari Osofsky, University of Minnesota. I really want to thank the panelists and the conference organizers for bringing together so many pieces of the movement. And so I have a broad question about that and then a very specific question. So the broad question is, how do we create better alignment among pieces of the movement? I know that the panel touched on this some, but it was really striking to me, for example, when I participated in a conference that brought together health and immigration and environment energy, how many of the same things were going on sort of rights issues across these areas, but the people weren't really working together on them. And so I would be curious as we think about the future of civil rights about your thoughts on the best strategies for bringing together the disparate pieces of the movement. And secondly, a more specific question, which is about sort of impact litigation. And in particular, I was working at Center for the public interest, CLPI, Center for Law and the Public Interest, when Sandoval came down, which obviously had devastating effects on so many pending civil rights cases, including environmental justice ones, and has had such long-term implications. And when I was working on the Shell Nigeria issue and we were looking at the possibilities of environmental rights strategy, one of the things that blocked that down were some bad precedents that had already been sort of created in the environmental rights area. And so I'm curious from a strategic perspective how those who are trying to use impact litigation as a tool for social change should be balancing between zealous advocacy for their clients and thinking strategically about how to avoid bad precedent.
Could I comment on two earlier points? One very quickly about students and voting, or contemporary movements and voting. And I couldn't agree more that the ways in which we have to encourage the younger populations, I'm happy to turn it over to our youth, is to also make clear how political and legislative change is going to be a vehicle for the kind of social and cultural change that we want, and that happens by registering to vote. I think we have to twin those. I also want to make a quick comment on marriage. I am an ardent supporter of Obergefell and the political and economic and social goods that come from that. Matter of fact, as my two students who are passing out mics will talk about, we just talked about loving yesterday in class. But the critique I didn't have a chance to offer is the cultural one about how we create a normative culture of marriage as the ways in which social organization or private organizations, families are made. So the potential for family life to be constituted in a particular way, the heteronormative construct of marriage being moved to gay and lesbian couples, also getting the benefit of that heterosexual normativity, does not happen without our also undergirding that heteronormative context, without also a critique of that as the ways in which families are made.
So I want to take a brief swipe at a few of these questions. I'm intrigued. I want to think more about this issue of love because I think it's a very complex discussion, and I think in some ways we may be talking past each other, but we would need to have more conversation. I was with my wife, we were in Atlanta last weekend for a commemoration of the life of Yolanda King, Martin Luther King's older daughter, who died a few years ago, a dear friend. And there was a sign that we just happened to see on the side of the road, big neon sign, and it said, let me try to get this right, it was about forgiveness, and it said, not forgiving is like drinking the poison and expecting the rat to die. And I thought about that, and I said, well, that's right. Some of this, and it depends on what we're talking about when we say love, but some of it is deeply personal. I've realized that for me, it's so important not to get engaged in, personal anger or, being an enemy of my adversaries. That's for me. It's very selfish, for my own well-being, based in that concept. And so is that love? Maybe it is in a form, but it's not it's not the personal, private space love. It is, I think, what Dr. King tried to talk about. And so I think there's it's worth having a broader discussion, even when we talk about law enforcement. And it doesn't mean that we let them off the hook. Quite to the contrary, they have to be accountable. No matter how I relate to them, they have to be accountable. That's what this is all about. So that's one piece I wanted to take a swipe at. Very quickly, I also think that this business of different movements and whether one can undercut the other, et cetera, you've heard a little bit about Reverend Barber. He really is a visionary. But here in North Carolina, the belly of the beast right now, there's a wonderful movement that has been assembled. And the governor and the legislature and all of these Luddites on issues of race and all these other issues, they despise Reverend Barber, and they despise this movement, and they're out to destroy anybody they can find who's been in the Capitol for Moral Monday protests. It is McCarthyism, but it's a movement that crosses lines of race and gender and sexual orientation, and brings in the labor movement, or what's left of it. It's a model. I'll just say that. It is a model. And so we could have a broad discussion about that. Finally, on this point of young people and the right to vote, or exercising the right to vote, absolutely. I think it's true. It's hard to get people to vote because they're so cynical about having nothing to vote for. I get that. That's a tough thing to continue to push people on. But among us chickens, Ferguson, how could that city have a white city council and the mayor it had? And we got to hold ourselves accountable too, to some degree. And somebody asked me years ago whether I'd run for political office. I said no. They said, why? I said, because politics is such a dirty game. And they said, without missing a beat, yeah, but it's the only game in town. They were right. And it remains right, even though I didn't run for political office. But I do vote. And if if you don't vote, as a civil rights activist, one of the martyrs of the movement said, if you don't vote, you don't count.
And I'll respond to the one on marriage, because I think marriage is a very complicated institution. So there's an element of it's very much about privacy. Like, once I'm married and I have my family, I am the little, commonwealth of democracy, a sphere unto myself with autonomy, and I'm the bulwark against the state. And then the question is, who gets access to the fortress of marriage? Yeah. At the same time, I think the same-sex marriage movement focused a lot on the public benefits, but in a way that almost commodified marriage and turned it into the sum total of all its goodies that attach as a result. I do think there are some things that can be learned from that experience. One is that I think they really generated a lot of high-quality data to show that the fears and myths were unfounded. And then we had the Williams Institute at UCLA, we still do, which really generated a lot of that information. And their goal was to say, if you think that, someone who's gay can't be a barber because they're too dangerous, let's get you some data. And they actually, seriously, and they put it out on their website, and they did it nationally, locally, in communities. So you could go to your legislator and say, here's the authoritative data that we have from UCLA. So I think having authoritative data in an evidence-driven form of advocacy, which is very common now, is important. The other thing that I think that they did that was important is they didn't choose between liberty and equality. They really found a way to say, and I feel this is important in the civil rights movement, that one reason our equality discourse became somewhat sterile is we unlinked it from the liberties that it was supposed to advance. And I think they reconnected those in ways that they then said meant dignity, right? A liberty and equality together add up to dignity. I think that was a very important model. The final thing that I want to
get to your fifth vote.
Yes. And the final thing that I wanted to mention is sometimes you lose in the short run, but you win in the long run. And there's a piece by Doug Nijame called Winning by Losing, in which he describes the ways in which the marriage equality movement really used the setbacks to mobilize the community and regroup and go back. And I think, therefore, sometimes, if you only think about the legal side of it in terms of should we go for a case if the precedent might be negative, there's also a whole set of political considerations that attend the decision to litigate, which I think Doug captured very well in that piece. So that would be mine.
That's right. That's right. I don't know if you all notice, this is too much information, but you all notice the dynamic that proves women's superiority once again. Two of us on the panel already got up, and I'm about to. Excuse me one moment.
With that, we must end. We're actually over time. Thank you so much. Thank you for a really incredible conversation.
But I don't care.
You look great.
So James Foreman just backed out.